June 1789, the vast halls of Versailles. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and unwashed bodies, a suffocating atmosphere that perfectly mirrored the political stagnation of the French kingdom. To understand the explosion of the French Revolution, one must first look at the powder keg that had been fusing for centuries. The rigid hierarchy of the ancient regime, divided into three distinct social orders known as the estates. At the top stood the first estate, the clergy. Comprising roughly 130,000 individuals, they were not merely religious figures but a powerful political and economic force. They owned about 10% of all the land in France, a staggering figure that granted them immense wealth and independence from the central government. Yet, their position was paradoxically defined by their privilege. They were completely exempt from the taille, the primary direct tax, and paid only a symbolic annual sum to the king. In exchange for their spiritual guidance, they were expected to pray for the king's health and prosperity. However, by 1789, a significant rift had opened within their own ranks. While the high clergy enjoyed the privileges of the nobility, the lower clergy, composed of parish priests and monks who lived among the peasantry, felt increasingly alienated. They were overburdened by the costs of maintaining the Catholic Church's institutions, and found their traditional authority undermined by Enlightenment ideas, questioning the divine right of bishops. Just above the common people sat the second estate, the nobility. Although they made up less than 2% of the population, they held the lion's share of power and prestige. By right of birth, they owned approximately 25% of the land and held exclusive control over the highest military, judicial, and governmental offices. Their life was one of conspicuous consumption, defined by a lavish lifestyle funded by the very tax system they helped design for others. Like the clergy, the nobility were exempt from the taille and the hated gabelle, or salt tax. Instead, they paid the taille indirectly through the corvée, a forced labor tax for maintaining roads, which was often collected by royal agents rather than the nobles themselves. Their primary grievance was financial. As the state's debts mounted, they found themselves pressured to pay a new capitation tax, a move that threatened to erode their centuries-old immunity. They viewed the tax reforms proposed by the reformers not as necessary modernization, but as an existential attack on the social order itself. Beneath these two privileged tiers lay the third estate, a category so broad it encompassed everyone else. This was not a unified class in the modern sense, but a catch-all for peasants, urban artisans, merchants, lawyers, doctors, and the bourgeoisie. Together, they constituted over 95% of the population. They paid the bulk of the taxes, including the taille, the gabelle, and the corvée, while enjoying no special privileges. For the vast majority of this group, life was a struggle. The peasantry suffered under crushing feudal dues paid to their lords, while the urban poor starved amidst soaring bread prices. Even the wealthy bourgeoisie, despite their economic success, were barred from holding high state offices and were often ridiculed for their lack of noble blood. Yet, it was this group that became the engine of revolution. Educated in the new ideas of liberty and equality, they resented the inequality of the system. They paid for the king's wars and the church's upkeep, yet had no voice in governance. By the summer of 1789, these three estates were locked in a deadly stalemate. The king was desperate for money, the nobility refused to give up their exemptions, and the third estate was too poor to participate in the game of political maneuvering that kept the system running. They met in the same assembly hall, but they sat in different sections, spoke different languages, and lived in different worlds. The structural inequality of the Estates General was the first major crack in the foundation of the monarchy. It was a system designed to preserve the status quo, but in the face of economic catastrophe, it had become the primary obstacle to survival. When the deadlock proved insurmountable, the Third Estate realized that no amount of petitioning could change their fate within these walls. They would have to break the rules of the game entirely, leading to the historic transformation from subjects of the king to citizens of a nation. June 26, 1789, Paris, France. While the cobblestone streets below would soon echo with the roar of revolution, the true battle that toppled a kingdom was being fought quietly within the hushed, candle-lit chambers of the Versailles Palace. By the late summer of 1789, the French monarchy was not merely facing a crisis. It was standing on the precipice of collapse, crushed under a mountain of debt that had become so vast it seemed impossible to climb out. The ancient regime, for all its glory and tradition, was financially strangled. At the heart of this catastrophe lay a fundamental contradiction, a state that was simultaneously broke and bloated. For decades, the French government had engaged in a disastrous pattern of borrowing to fund an extravagant lifestyle and a sprawling, inefficient bureaucracy. Louis XVI and his successor, Louis XVI, were not known for their frugality. Their reign saw the construction of the magnificent Petit Trianon and the maintenance of a court that rivaled the extravagance of Versailles itself, all while the kingdom's economy sputtered under the weight of bad harvests, rampant inflation, and a rigid tax system that protected the privileged few. The result was a deficit that had spiraled out of control, leaving the royal treasury in a state of absolute bankruptcy. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must look at who paid the price. The tax system of France was archaic and deeply unfair. The nobility and the clergy, comprising the First and Second Estates, enjoyed almost complete exemption from the most burdensome taxes. Instead, the weight of the state fell almost entirely on the Third Estate, the peasants, the urban workers, and the burgeoning bourgeoisie. These were the people who produced the wealth of France, yet they were forced to pay the asterisk tail asterisk, the gabelle asterisk, and the corvée asterisk, while the aristocracy hunted in their chateaux, unbothered by the starving masses. This injustice was not merely an economic calculation. It was a moral outrage that had simmered for generations, now boiling over into a firestorm of anger. Yet before the people could rise, the king attempted a desperate fix. In 1786, Louis XVI, advised by his finance minister Turgot and later by the young economist Jacques Necker, sought to reform the financial structure. They proposed new taxes on the nobility and the clergy, aiming to finally make the wealthy pay their fair share. For a brief moment, it seemed hope was alive, but the reformers were met with a wall of resistance. The nobility, entrenched in their privilege, refused to consent to any measure that would erode their status. When Louis XVI attempted to dissolve the parliaments, the judicial bodies that also resisted reform, he only managed to create more enemies. The government found itself in a vicious cycle. It needed taxes to pay its debts, but it could not get the taxes without the consent of the very classes that owed the least. By the spring of 1789, the situation had become untenable. The royal family was forced to rely on foreign loans at exorbitant interest rates, further deepening the hole. The government could no longer pay its soldiers, its suppliers, or even the wages of its officials. The credit of France was ruined. Foreign bankers began to flee, realizing that the kingdom was a sinking ship. When the king finally called the Estates General in May 1789, hoping to solve the crisis through negotiation, it was clear that the old ways were dead. The financial crisis had stripped away the illusion of divine right and revealed the naked, desperate reality of a failing state. The debt was not just a number. It was the catalyst that would ignite the powder keg of French society, proving that a kingdom cannot survive forever if its foundation is built on the backs of the poor while the rich remain untouched. The stage was set, not for a debate, but for a revolution. May 5, 1789, Versailles. The air inside the vast hall of mirrors is thick with the scent of beeswax, nervous sweat, and impending doom. Outside, the French countryside is burning, and the royal treasury is empty, yet the king believes he can summon the ghosts of a bygone era to solve the problems of the present. For the first time in nearly a century, the Estates General has been called. It is not merely a parliament. It is an emergency meeting of the three orders of the ancient regime, a gathering designed to approve new taxes, but it quickly transforms into a theater of national grievance, where the foundations of the monarchy begin to crack. The assembly is a chaotic mosaic of 2,000 delegates, yet they are fundamentally divided not by geography, but by birthright. To the right sit the First Estate, the clergy. They are a mixed bag of bishops who wear the robes of kings and poor parish priests who have never seen a city. In the center sit the Second Estate, the nobility. They are the aristocracy of blood and sword, the men who own two-thirds of the land and hold a monopoly on high military and church offices. They arrive with the air of untouchable privilege, expecting the game to proceed exactly as it has for centuries. But in the center of the hall, occupying a third of the space, sit the Third Estate. These are the deputies of the common people, lawyers, doctors, merchants, and even a handful of impoverished peasants. They represent 98% of the population, yet they possess only one vote in the entire assembly. The structure of this gathering is rigged against the very people who are supposed to save the kingdom. Under the traditional rules of voting, each estate casts a single vote. This means that despite the Third Estate having 300 delegates compared to 100 for the clergy and 100 for the nobility, a coalition of just two privileged orders could always outvote the people 3-1. For the Third Estate, this is not just a mathematical inequality, it is a denial of their existence. When the king's ministers propose that the estates vote by order, the room erupts into a cacophony of protest. The Third Estate demands that the estates vote by head, where every delegate counts as one. They argue that since they represent the vast majority of the French populace, their collective voice should carry the weight of the nation. The tension in the hall is palpable. The nobility and the clergy, sensing a threat to their centuries-old privileges, retreat into a defensive huddle. They refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of voting by head, insisting on the sanctity of the traditional order. The king, Louis XVI, paralyzed by indecision and advised by his ministers to maintain the status quo, ultimately sides with the privileged orders. He grants the request to vote by head, but only after a massive delay, hoping that time will cool the passions of the mob. In his own mind, he believes he is preserving stability, but in the eyes of the Third Estate, he is signing their own death warrant. The atmosphere shifts from procedural debate to raw confrontation. Delegates from the Third Estate, led by the fiery orator Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, begin to articulate a new political philosophy that has no place in the old world order. Sieyès, in his pamphlet What is the Third Estate?, posits that the Third Estate is the nation itself, while the first and second estates are merely a parasite feeding on the body of the state. Their grievances are no longer just about unfair tax laws or the grain crisis. They are about sovereignty. They argue that true political power resides not in the blood of kings or the prayers of priests, but in the people. As the days pass, the gathering becomes less a parliament and more a battlefield of ideas. The privileged orders, realizing they cannot govern without the consent of the people, begin to fracture. Some nobles, disillusioned by the arrogance of their peers, defect to the third estate. The clergy, too, splits, with many progressive priests joining the commoners in protest against the king's intransigence. The Hall of Mirrors, once a symbol of absolute monarchy, now echoes with the sound of a revolution being born in slow motion. The Estates General of 1789 has failed to function as a tax-raising body, but in its failure, it has achieved something far more dangerous. It has forced the French nation to confront the fact that the social contract has been broken, and the old rules no longer apply. The grievances brought to Versailles on that fateful May Day are now demands for a rebirth of the French nation. June 20th, 1789, Versailles. The air inside the Grand Salle de Jeu de Paume, a tennis court attached to the royal palace, is thick with the scent of fear and the sweat of desperation. Outside, the storm clouds of the French Revolution are gathering, but inside these walls, the storm is being forged by human will alone. 350 representatives of the Third Estate, the common people of France, find themselves locked out of the meeting hall by King Louis XVI's guards. Denied access to their own legislative chamber, the National Assembly faces an impossible dilemma: disperse and return to their respective estates, surrendering their hard-won power to the monarch, or stand their ground against a king who has never truly understood the concept of popular sovereignty. The room is tense, filled with the murmur of angry voices and the clatter of chairs. Among them stands Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the fiery orator whose pamphlet "What is the Third Estate?" had ignited the fires of debate just days prior. He understands the gravity of the moment. Without a vote, without the king's signature, and without the ability to function as a parliament, their work is undone. The king believes they are merely a temporary nuisance, a mob of lawyers and journalists playing at politics, unaware that they are attempting to dismantle the very foundation of the ancient regime. But these men are no longer petitioning the king. They are trying to create a nation. When the doors remain shut, the crowd does not break. Instead, they move with a singular purpose. They carry their tables and benches across the court, transforming the playing field into a makeshift assembly hall. In the center of the room, beneath the eyes of the royal flag and the royal arms, they gather. The mood shifts from frustration to a profound, terrifying resolve. They realize that if they leave today, the revolution dies before it begins. They must become a sovereign power in their own right, independent of the crown. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, a moderate but determined astronomer and former mayor of Paris, takes the floor. He proposes a radical act. He suggests that they swear an oath not to separate until a constitution is established for the Kingdom of France. It is a promise to remain united, regardless of the cost. The proposal is met with silence, followed by a thunderous, overwhelming roar of approval. This is not just a meeting. It is a declaration of war against the old order. One by one, the representatives rise. They place their right hands over their hearts, forming a solemn chain of unity. "We swear," Bailey cries out, his voice echoing off the stone walls, never to separate from one another, nor to dissolve the National Assembly before a constitution adopted and ratified by the nation is established. The oath is taken. In this moment, something unbreakable is born. The authority of the king is no longer absolute. It is now conditional, subject to the will of the people represented in this room. The concept of national sovereignty, that the people, not the monarch, are the source of all political power, crystallizes into reality. This oath is the legal and moral birth certificate of modern France. It transforms a gathering of petitioners into a legitimate governing body. Louis XVI, watching from his windows, is initially confused, then perhaps a little worried, but he underestimates the depth of their commitment. He assumes they will scatter at the first sign of trouble. He does not see the steel in their resolve. He fails to realize that by locking them out of the hall, he has inadvertently forced them to create a new France. The tennis court oath marks the definitive end of divine right and the beginning of the age of democracy. It is the moment the people of France stopped asking the king for rights and started claiming them as their own, laying the groundwork for the storm that will soon engulf Paris and change the world forever. May 14, 1789, Versailles. The air in the royal palace is thick with the scent of lavender and the unspoken tension of a kingdom teetering on the brink. Outside, the summer sun beats down on the French countryside, but for the peasants and the urban poor, a different kind of storm is brewing. It is not made of rain or thunder, but of rumor, desperation, and a profound, paralyzing terror. This is the beginning of the Great Fear. As the harvest approaches, a wave of panic sweeps across the provinces of France. Rumors spread with terrifying speed through rural villages like wildfire. Serfs whisper that feudal lords have hired bands of brigands to burn crops, steal livestock, and massacre the population to prevent any harvest from reaching the table. They claim that aristocrats are poisoning the grain and that the church is complicit in the bloodshed. Without written newspapers or reliable communication, these stories take on a life of their own, transforming anxiety into a genuine belief that their existence is under immediate threat. In response to this manufactured or imagined apocalypse, the peasantry rises in defense of their own survival. In Normandy, the countryside rises up against its local lords. They burn manor houses, destroy records of feudal dues, and drag tax collectors out of their beds. The Great Fear is a bottom-up uprising, a desperate bid for autonomy driven by the primal instinct to protect one's family and land. It is a chaotic, decentralized rebellion that shatters the illusion of royal control. The king's authority evaporates in the face of a nation that believes it is being attacked from within its own fields. While the countryside burns, the political center in Paris is equally volatile. The National Assembly has been meeting for weeks, struggling to draft a constitution that satisfies a starving populace. But the streets of Paris have their own demands. Hunger is the only language the people speak, and they are demanding bread at any cost. The situation comes to a head on July 12, when a mob storms the grain market in Paris, burning the royal granaries. The city is on the verge of a food riot, a scenario that could easily spiral into total anarchy. It is into this crucible of hunger and fear that the Bastille enters the narrative. To the people of Paris, the Bastille is not merely a prison. It is the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny, the Black Tower that has longed to crush the spirit of the Third Estate. Its walls hold hundreds of political prisoners, and its armory is rumored to contain thousands of muskets and cannons. With the city running low on gunpowder and ammunition, and the royal guard refusing to provide more, The people of Paris know they must act. They need weapons, and they need a symbol to break. On the evening of July 13, 1789, a rumor begins to circulate in the streets. A royal regiment of Swiss guards has marched into Paris, and their commander, Count Dillon, has issued a threat. He will shoot anyone who enters the Bastille. The mood shifts from protest to insurrection. By the early hours of July 14, thousands of armed citizens, fueled by rage and fear, begin to march toward the fortress on the Isle de la Cité. They carry pikes, scythes, and cannons mounted on carts. The sound of marching boots echoes off the Seine, a drum roll for history. The assault is brutal and desperate. The Swiss guards retreat, leaving the fortress to be battered by the mob. Women are among the first to break the doors, using their strength and determination to force entry. Once inside, the mob searches for the king's prisoners, finding only a few who are immediately released. But the true prize is the gunpowder. When the last crate is opened and the barrels are weighed, the crowd finds that the fortress holds only a tiny amount of powder. The symbol of absolute power has been breached, but the immediate need for weapons remains. The fall of the Bastille is not just a military victory, it is a psychological earthquake. Within hours, news of the breach travels to Versailles, causing King Louis XVI to flee the palace in terror. Across France, the news triggers a chain reaction of uprisings. In Bordeaux, the mob destroys the prison. In Nantes, the Duke of Bourbon is forced to flee. In Orleans, the bishop is stripped of his office. The Bastille may have been a prison of only 7 inmates at the time, but its fall shattered the old order forever. It proved that the people could rise up, that the king was not invincible, and that the era of the ancient regime was over. As the smoke clears over Paris, the Bastille is toppled, its walls reduced to rubble. The great clock is smashed, and the cannonballs are melted down to make bullets for the National Guard. On the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville, a tricolor cockade, the blue, white, and red of Paris, the French flag and the royal flag is raised. It is a moment of euphoria and hope, but also of terrifying uncertainty. The storm has broken, and as the revolutionary winds blow across France, there is no guarantee that the violence will ever truly cease. The age of liberty has begun, but the path to it will be paved with blood. June 17, 1789, Versailles. The air inside the Hall of Mirrors hangs heavy with the scent of wax candles and unspoken fury. For centuries, the French monarchy had operated on an ancient, unbreakable principle. The king is the embodiment of the state, and his authority flows directly from God. He speaks and the kingdom listens. He commands and the law obeys. But today, that divine right is being challenged not by a foreign army, but by the king's own subjects, the very third estate deputies who were summoned here to discuss the kingdom's finances. The deadlock had reached a breaking point. The king, Louis XVI, and his ministers had refused to allow the Third Estate to vote by head, insisting instead on voting by order. This meant that the two privileged estates, the clergy and the nobility, could combine their numbers to drown out the voice of the common people, effectively vetoing any reform. The Third Estate, comprising the merchants, lawyers, and laborers who shouldered the tax burden of the nation, found themselves in a political stranglehold. They were a minority in the assembly, but they were the majority in spirit and necessity. Frustrated by the king's intransigence, the Third Estate did what the old system could never have imagined. They declared themselves the National Assembly. In doing so, they made a revolutionary assertion. Sovereignty did not reside in the person of the king, but in the nation itself. This was a theoretical earthquake that shattered the bedrock of feudal Europe. If the nation was sovereign, then the king was merely a servant of the nation, a figurehead whose power was derived from the consent of the governed. However, Louis XVI was a man of habit and tradition, unwilling to accept the premise of his own diminishment. When the deputies locked themselves inside a tennis court at the Palace of Versailles, refusing to disperse, the king ordered the guards to break down the doors. He believed the mere presence of armed soldiers would compel the deputies to submit. He was wrong. Instead of surrendering, the deputies took up their pencils and their pens, viewing the military threat not as a tool of enforcement, but as an act of aggression against the will of the nation. The standoff reached its climax as the National Assembly drafted the tennis court oath. They swore to remain assembled and to adopt a constitution for the Kingdom of France, or to die in the attempt. This oath was the birth certificate of modern democracy in France. It transformed a group of political representatives into a sovereign body with the power to make laws, levy taxes, and rewrite the social contract. By taking this oath, they effectively broke the royal power's monopoly on lawmaking. No longer did the king hold the pen, the assembly held it. In the days that followed, the assembly moved with lightning speed to solidify their new position. They declared the National Guard, initially composed of the deputies' servants and citizens, under their command rather than the king's. They began to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, outlining the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity that would become the conscience of the new era. Every act was a direct challenge to the divine order. When Louis XVI attempted to dissolve the assembly or call for new elections, the deputies simply ignored him, treating his royal decrees as null and void. This period marked the most dangerous and pivotal moment of the early revolution. The king realized that he could no longer rule as an absolute monarch. The logic of the revolution demanded that he accept the new reality or be dragged out of his palace. The National Assembly had successfully transferred the center of gravity from the throne to the people. It was a fragile victory, resting on the hope that the mob outside the palace would not turn their rage upon the king, but would instead support the deputies in Paris. Yet, the power dynamic had irreversibly shifted. The era of absolute monarchy was over, and the age of the constitutional monarchy, born from the blood and ink of the National Assembly, had begun. August 26, 1789, Versailles. The air inside the hall of the Jeu de Paume was thick with the scent of old wood and the electric hum of 1,000 voices finally speaking as one. It was here, just days after the storming of the Bastille, that the National Assembly, now reconstituting itself as the National Constituent Assembly, faced its most profound moral and intellectual challenge. The monarchy had fallen, feudal privileges were dissolving, but what was being built in their place? The assembly needed a foundational text, a new social contract to replace the divine right of kings with a secular, universal truth. This document would be the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The drafting process was a frantic race against time. Led by the moderate aristocrat Louis de Lafayette and the intellectual force of reason, Mirabeau, the committee worked through the long, hot days of mid-August. They were not inventing new rights from scratch. They were synthesizing the Enlightenment ideals of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, refining them into a practical legal framework for a modern nation. When Lafayette proposed the famous preamble, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it ignited a fierce debate. The radical left demanded more specific guarantees for the working classes, while the right feared a slide into anarchy. The compromise struck in those final hours became the bedrock of the French Revolution. As the ink dried on the parchment, the text declared that society, in its effort to maintain the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, had recognized the right to property and resistance to oppression. These words were revolutionary in their simplicity and their power. Article 1 established the principle of natural equality, shattering the ancient hierarchy that had divided France into clergy, nobility, and commoners for centuries. Article 2 stripped away the mystique of monarchy, stating that the purpose of any political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. It explicitly listed these rights as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. What followed was a radical reordering of the relationship between the individual and the state. The Declaration argued that sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, and no body, nor any individual, can exercise authority that does not proceed directly from the nation. This was the death knell for absolute monarchy. The principle of separation of powers was enshrined to ensure that the executive, legislative, and judicial branches could not conspire against the people. Furthermore, the text introduced the concept of legal equality before the law, ensuring that distinctions based on birth, rank, or wealth would henceforth have no place in the law. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of the Declaration was Article 10, which guaranteed freedom of opinion, including religious opinion. It declared that every man being presumed innocent until proved guilty, the law only forbids those actions which are injurious to society. This was a stark departure from the religious censorship and arbitrary imprisonment of the ancient regime. The document also addressed the economic order, asserting that any society in which the guarantee of rights is not assured, or the separation of powers not defined, has no constitution. It linked economic freedom to political liberty, promising free trade and the protection of private property, a crucial point for the bourgeoisie who had driven the revolution. On that sweltering afternoon in August 1789, the Declaration was more than a piece of paper. It was a mirror reflecting a new world. It codified the idea that rights were not gifts granted by a king, but inherent possessions of every human being. While it would soon face the brutal tests of the terror and the chaos of the Directory, and while its promise of liberty was sometimes overshadowed by the reality of violence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen remains one of the most influential texts in human history. It planted the seeds for modern democracy, influencing the U.S. Bill of Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and countless constitutions across the globe. In Versailles, the people had not just overthrown a king, they had defined themselves. They had written the first chapter of a modern era where power flowed from the people, not to them. June 20, 1789, Versailles. For centuries, the French countryside had been defined not by law, but by custom, a tangled web of obligations known as feudalism. Peasants toiled under the yoke of the nobility, surrendering a third, sometimes half of their harvest to seigneurs in exchange for the dubious protection of a crumbling castle. They were bound by corvée labor, forced to work on the lord's land, and crushed by arbitrary tolls at local bridges and mills. Yet, amidst the heat of the Estates General and the swelling anger of the Third Estate, a quiet but seismic shift was about to occur in the minds of France's new leaders. It was clear that a constitutional monarchy could not survive if the very foundation of its economy rested on a system of arbitrary privilege that denied the nation's most productive class any rights. On this fateful evening, the National Assembly, now operating in the chaotic atmosphere of the palace, turned its gaze toward the past to dismantle its shackles. The debate was fierce, pitting the traditionalist views of the clergy and the moderate bourgeoisie against the radical demands of the peasants who were already beginning to rise up in the countryside. The assembly recognized that without the abolition of feudal privileges, the revolution would merely be a change of masters, not a transformation of society. With a resounding vote, the National Assembly moved to decree the abolition of feudalism, effectively ending a social order that had persisted since the Middle Ages. The decree, known as the August Decrees, was revolutionary in its scope. It did not merely suggest reform, it erased the legal existence of feudal dues. All seigneurial rights were declared void, and the system of personal servitude was abolished overnight. No peasant could be forced to work on a lord's land without pay, and the right of the lord to demand a portion of the harvest vanished. This was not a gradual negotiation. It was a unilateral severing of ties between the classes that had defined France for generations. However, the assembly was pragmatic as well as idealistic. They understood that while the legal bonds were broken, the reality on the ground was different. Peasants had already begun seizing lands and refusing to pay dues in anticipation of the decree, and they demanded compensation for improvements they had made to the land over decades. Consequently, the decree allowed for the redemption of seigneurial lands. Peasants could purchase their freedom from remaining dues, often at a steep price, effectively paying for their liberation in capital rather than labor. This created a complex transition. The legal end of feudalism was immediate, but the economic settling of accounts would drag on for years. The impact was instantaneous and profound. In the weeks following this vote, news traveled faster than royal messengers. Across the vast expanses of France, from the marshes of Brittany to the vineyards of Champagne, the news sparked a wave of jubilation. The great fear that had paralyzed the countryside months earlier began to transform into a revolutionary fervor. Villages that had cowered before local lords now saw their boundaries redrawn. The distinction between the noble and the commoner, once written in blood and soil, was now struck from the books. This moment marked the true social upheaval of the early revolution. It signaled that sovereignty resided not in the king's divine right to command, but in the collective will of the nation to define its own future. The abolition of feudalism was more than an economic adjustment. It was the first major step toward the creation of a citizenry equal before the law. It dismantled the hierarchical pyramid that had stifled innovation and mobility for centuries, replacing it with a new vision where land ownership and personal liberty were the birthright of every Frenchman. As the ink dried on the decree, the silence of the feudal past was shattered by the noise of a society reborn, ready to confront the challenges of a new world where privilege would no longer dictate destiny. October 5, 1789, Versailles. The air outside the palace is thick with a feverish anticipation, a mixture of hunger and righteous anger that has been simmering in the Parisian streets for weeks. Inside the magnificent hall of mirrors, the atmosphere is far less festive. Here, the royal court is preparing for a desperate game of brinkmanship. The National Assembly has refused to leave until a constitution is written, but the true crisis lies not in politics, but in the bellies of the common people. Bread prices have skyrocketed due to bad harvests and poor grain transport policies, leading to a desperate food shortage. When rumors spread that the king's forces were gathering to disperse the mob, and that the royal household was hoarding food, a spark was lit that would consume the monarchy. At the head of the mob stands a woman named Jeanne de Vaubernier, known to history as the Marchioness de Lisa. Though some accounts suggest her role was exaggerated by royalists to discredit her, the sheer number of women marching behind her is undeniable. They are not soldiers. They are mothers, wives, and daughters, clutching children and carrying makeshift weapons like pitchforks and broken cartwheels. They sing the Marseillaise, a revolutionary anthem that has already taken root in the hearts of the people. Their demand is simple yet terrifying in its simplicity: bread and the king. They want the monarch to stand with them, to protect them from the chaos outside, and to ensure that the royal larder is open to the starving masses. The king, Louis XVI, and Queen Marie Antoinette, initially dismissive of the threat, soon realized the gravity of the situation. The National Guard, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, attempts to negotiate, but the crowd surges forward, tearing down the barriers surrounding the royal palaces. The mob storms the Tuileries, ransacking it for food and wine. In the face of this overwhelming force, the king is forced to capitulate. He and the royal family, now effectively prisoners of the people, are escorted to the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. Here, amidst the cheers of the revolutionaries who believe they have saved the king from the mob, they are handed over to the municipal guards. The journey back to the capital is a triumphal march for the revolutionaries and a humiliating defeat for the monarchy. Thousands march alongside the royal carriage, singing and waving tricolor cockades. The sight of the king, dressed in his royal robes yet looking small against the sea of faces, marks a pivotal moment in the French Revolution. It is the moment the symbolic distance between the ruler and the ruled is violently collapsed. The king is no longer a distant figure in a secluded palace. He is now a prisoner in the very city he was supposed to rule from. Upon their arrival in Paris, the king is transferred to the Palais Royal, and then, just days later, to the Hôtel de Ville. The decision is made, however, to move the entire royal family to the Tuileries Palace, located within the heart of the city. On October 6, the king, queen, and their children, accompanied by the royal household and the National Guard, arrive at the Tuileries. The move is greeted with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The people celebrate their victory, believing they have secured the king's safety, but the political reality has shifted irrevocably. The royal family is now under the watchful eye of the Parisian mob and the National Guard. The king's attempts to maintain his independence are stifled by the very people he meant to protect. This relocation sets the stage for the next act of drama: the flight to Varennes, an attempt to escape the city that would prove the king could no longer be trusted to remain a constitutional monarch. The March on Versailles did not just bring bread to Paris. It brought the king himself into the fire of revolution, forever changing the nature of his reign. June 20, 1791, Varennes-en-Argonne. The air in this small village along the river Aube is thick with the confusion of a nation holding its breath. Just days prior, the King of France, Louis XVI, and his family had seemingly escaped the very hands that would soon destroy them. Following the Women's March on Versailles, which forced the royal family to relocate from the Tuileries Palace in Paris to the more secure Château de Compiègne, an atmosphere of profound distrust had settled over the monarchy. The people of Paris, now in control of the capital through the National Guard and the Commune, feared for their safety. They believed Louis XVI was a tyrant in disguise, a monarch plotting to restore the absolute power of the ancient regime and crush the revolution from behind the walls of the Tuileries. In response to this paranoia, a group of radical deputies, led by the fiery Jean-Paul Marat, drafted a petition demanding the dissolution of the royal family and the abolition of the monarchy. The king, desperate to regain his political initiative and restore the credibility of his authority, secretly decided to flee. He hoped to reach the Austrian border, where his wife, Marie Antoinette, was from, and enlist the support of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II to intervene militarily on his behalf and force the National Assembly to reinstate him as an absolute monarch. On the night of June 20th, disguised as a simple groom, the king, along with his wife dressed as a servant and their youngest son, Charles, attempted to escape the Campigny Palace. The rest of the royal family, including the children and their confidants, were hidden in the carriage, their faces covered. For several terrifying hours, the royal party crept through the dark forests of the Ile-de-France, moving cautiously toward the east. However, the National Assembly, realizing the gravity of the situation, had anticipated a flight and dispatched a cavalry unit to intercept them. The order came from the National Guard commander, Lafayette, who believed that allowing the king to flee would destroy the constitutional experiment and plunge France into civil war. By the morning of June 21st, the royal party reached the town of Varennes. Exhausted and disoriented, they sought shelter at the Hôtel de l'Isle, where a local notary named M. de la Tour du Pin and his wife had offered hospitality. It was here that the fatal mistake occurred. The notary, recognizing the king by his voice and bearing despite his disguise, immediately raised the alarm. He rushed to the town priest, who in turn alerted the local National Guard captain. Within minutes, the town was in a state of panic, and the guardsmen surrounded the inn. The capture of the royal family was total. The king, trembling and weeping, was forced to remove his disguise, revealing the crown prince and the desperate, terrified faces of his wife and children. He was dragged to a prison cell while the guards secured the town. News of the arrest spread like wildfire, instantly changing the political landscape of France. The flight to Varennes was not just a personal failure for Louis XVI. It was the death knell of the constitutional monarchy. It proved that the king could not be trusted with even a fraction of executive power, and that his true allegiance lay with foreign powers rather than the French nation. The trust that had been the fragile foundation of the revolution evaporated overnight. The moderate Girondins and the constitutional king were now seen as enemies of the people, and the radical Jacobins saw their opportunity to seize control. The idea of a king who could be removed from office while the people were supposedly free was no longer viable. The events of Varennes marked the definitive end of any hope for a compromise between the old regime and the new republic. The stage was set for the radicalization that would follow, leading directly to the abolition of the monarchy later that year and the descent into the Reign of Terror. The flight to Varennes had shown the world that the revolution was no longer a negotiation. It was now a war of survival. July 1793, Paris. The air in the revolutionary capital was no longer charged with the hopeful anticipation of liberty, but thick with the metallic tang of fear and the urgent rhythm of war drums. As the foreign armies of the First Coalition pushed against France's borders and internal counter-revolutionary revolts erupted in the provinces, the National Convention faced an existential crisis. The government of the Girondins had failed to secure victory. They were viewed by the radical Montagnards as too slow, too moderate, and dangerously aligned with the very aristocrats they sought to destroy. In this moment of total emergency, the convention made a fateful decision that would irrevocably alter the course of history. They created the Committee of Public Safety. Initially established with 12 members on April 6, 1793, the committee was intended as a temporary executive body to manage the war effort and police internal security. However, as the situation deteriorated, the committee's power swelled into a shadow dictatorship. The convention began to appoint more members, eventually expanding the body to 15. Yet one man emerged from the group as its undisputed sole, if not always its sole commander. That man was Maximilien Robespierre. Known to his friends as the Incorruptible, Robespierre possessed a moral rigidity and a philosophical conviction that frightened his fellow revolutionaries as much as the enemies without. He believed that the Republic could only survive through virtue, and that virtue without terror was futile, while terror without virtue was monstrous. Robespierre transformed the Committee of Public Safety into the de facto government of France. He argued that to save the Republic, the state needed to suspend the normal rules of law for those who threatened its existence. Under his influence, the committee began to operate with a chilling efficiency, bypassing traditional bureaucratic channels. They did not just make policy, they dictated the lives of every citizen, from the baker in the market square to the general on the battlefield. The committee issued decrees that requisitioned food, controlled prices, and mandated the levée en masse, a total mobilization of the nation's manpower for the war effort. The true nature of the committee under Robespierre became clear when it shifted its focus from external enemies to internal dissent. The logic was absolute. Anyone who opposed the revolution was an enemy of the people, and an enemy of the people was an enemy of liberty. This mindset laid the groundwork for the law of suspects, passed just weeks before the committee's full ascendancy, which defined treason with such vague parameters that it encompassed a vast swath of the population. Robespierre and his allies on the committee, including figures like Georges Danton, before his fall, Charles-Louis François de la Reyvillière-Lepeau, and Jean-Marie Collot de Herbois, began to purge the convention itself. They targeted the moderate Girondins, arguing that their presence was a cancer infecting the revolutionary body. The committee's authority was absolute. They controlled the Revolutionary Tribunal, the court that tried accused traitors, and they influenced the verdicts that led to the guillotine. Robespierre did not seek personal wealth or power in the traditional sense. His motivation was a desperate, fanatical belief that he was the only man capable of saving the Republic from tyranny and chaos. He saw himself as the embodiment of the general will, a guardian of the virtue necessary to maintain a democratic society under siege. Yet, this very absolutism created a paradox. The most democratic government in history had become a totalitarian police state. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, became the engine of the reign of terror, a machine that ground down the old order and the new moderate alike, believing that only through blood could the people be purified. As the months wore on, the distinction between the committee's members and the common citizen vanished. All were consumed by the same fever of suspicion and the relentless demand for justice. September 17, 1793, Paris. The air in the capital was not just thick with the smoke of bonfires and the stench of fear, but suffocated by a new, terrifying logic. For years, the revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but by late 1793, those ideals had curdled into a desperate machinery of suspicion. The Committee of Public Safety, led by the uncompromising Maximilien Robespierre, had concluded that the internal enemy was as dangerous as any foreign army. To survive, the Republic needed a weapon sharper than the guillotine, a net wide enough to catch every potential traitor. This net was the law of suspects. Passed on September 17, 1793, this legislation effectively dismantled the legal protections that had existed for centuries. Previously, to be arrested, one needed concrete evidence of a crime. The law of suspects abolished this requirement. It declared anyone guilty of suspicion, and suspicion was now a fluid concept defined by the state's paranoia. If you were a noble or had relatives who were nobles, you were suspect. If you had been absent from your workplace, you were suspect. If you had expressed regret for the revolution or advocated for peace, you were suspect. Even a mere shady look or a lack of revolutionary fervor could be grounds for arrest. The law did not specify how long a suspect could be detained without trial, creating a legal limbo where imprisonment was the punishment for thinking differently. To process this flood of accused citizens, the government relied on the Revolutionary Tribunal. Established earlier that year by March 1793, it was designed to be swift, but under the pressure of the terror it became a factory of death. The tribunal was a grotesque parody of justice. The proceedings were rushed, often taking only minutes. Defense lawyers were frequently silenced, their arguments labeled as counter-revolutionary. The judges, known as asterisk jurés, were not independent legal minds but representatives of the popular will, instructed to convict. The standard for guilt shifted from beyond a reasonable doubt to evidence of intent, where intent was often inferred solely from the circumstances of one's arrest. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was claustrophobic. Accused individuals were often thrown into the dock with little time to speak. Questions were asked not to uncover the truth, but to confirm the verdict already decided by the accuser. As the historian François Furet noted, the tribunal did not seek the truth. It sought the appearance of revolutionary purity. The outcome was statistically inevitable. Of the nearly 3,000 people brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal during the height of the terror, over 1,300 were sentenced to death, a death rate of nearly 44%. This was not justice. It was a lottery where the ticket was your opinion. The impact on French society was devastating. The law of suspects created an environment where loyalty could no longer be passive. Every citizen became an informant, every neighbor a potential spy. Trust evaporated from the streets of Paris. Families turned on one another. Neighbors denounced neighbors for owning too many sheep or for speaking with an accent. The law blurred the line between citizen and criminal, suggesting that any hesitation, any doubt was treason. It transformed the revolution from a political movement into a total war against the self. By the end of 1793, the tribunal was churning out executions at a pace that horrified even some of its own allies. The promise of the revolution, that the people would judge themselves, had been hijacked by a bureaucracy that judged the people based on suspicion. The law of suspects and the Revolutionary Tribunal stand as the dark heart of the terror, a testament to the terrifying reality that, when a government feels it is under existential threat, it is willing to sacrifice the very rights it claims to protect. They are the mechanisms that turned the blood of thousands into a grim fertilizer for the Republic, ensuring that in the name of safety, France would lose its soul. May 31, 1793, Paris. The air in the Jacobin Club is thick not with smoke, but with the heavy, suffocating scent of impending doom. For months, the city of Paris has been a cauldron of fear, where the sans-culottes demand justice and the Jacobins seek order, but the internal fractures within the revolutionary government have finally become a chasm too wide to bridge. Today, the stage is set for the most brutal political purge of the revolution, a moment where the ideology of liberty turns its sharpest blade inward against its own architects. The target is the Girondins. The Girondins, led by figures like Jacques-Pierre Brissot and Gensenet, had long represented the moderate wing of the revolution. Originally from the province of the Gironde, they advocated for a republican constitution and a war against foreign monarchies to export their ideals. However, as the conflict with foreign powers intensified and the threat of invasion loomed, their moderate stance shifted from a liability into a perceived threat to the very survival of the Republic. In the eyes of the radical Jacobins and the Paris Commune, the Girondins were now accused of being counter-revolutionaries, hoarding grain, collaborating with the king, and plotting to restore the monarchy. They were seen as a faction that sought to halt the momentum of the people's revolution. The path to their destruction began earlier in the spring, marked by escalating tensions in the National Convention. On April 20th, the radical journalist Jacques Habert published a scathing article in *Le Pire Duchesne, labeling the Girondins traitors. This was not merely political criticism, it was a call to arms. The situation reached a boiling point on May 31st, when the Paris Commune, dominated by the Jacobins, moved to arrest 12 Girondin deputies. These men were dragged from their seats in the National Convention, their names called out one by one, marking the beginning of the end for their party. The atmosphere in Paris was electric with violence. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to judge those suspected of counter-revolutionary activities, was now weaponized to eliminate the Girondin leadership. Between May 31st and June 2nd, nearly 100 Girondin deputies were arrested. The purge was swift and systematic, designed to crush any remaining opposition from within the legislature. The Girondins were not given the chance to defend their positions in a free and open debate. Their mere existence was deemed an existential threat to the Republic. On June 2nd, the climax of the purge arrived. The arrested deputies were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The proceedings were a sham, a farce conducted in the shadow of the guillotine. The charges were vague: conspiracy, counter-revolutionary agitation, and treason. The evidence was non-existent, yet the verdict was inevitable. By June 24th, the first batch of Girondin leaders, including Brissot and Vergniaud, were sent to the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. Their execution sent a shiver of terror through the French political landscape. It was a definitive message from the Jacobin leadership. There would be no room for dissent. The moderate republic was dead. The radical republic, ruled by the sword, had taken its place. The fall of the Girondins marked a turning point in the revolution. It demonstrated that the freedom being fought for was conditional, available only to those who fully aligned with the radical vision of the Jacobins and the Parisian mob. It paved the way for the height of the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre would eventually consolidate his power, believing that only through fear and violence could the Republic be saved from internal and external enemies. The blood spilled on the cobblestones of Paris on those hot June days would stain the memory of the revolution forever, proving that the path to liberty often runs through a valley of darkness. January 21, 1793, Place de la Révolution in Paris. The air is thick with the scent of wet stone and the grim anticipation of a crowd that has watched empires crumble and rise in mere months. Today, the stage is set not for a coronation, but for an ending. After months of debate, treason trials, and the frantic maneuvering of the Jacobins against the Girondins, the National Convention has made its final, irreversible decision. King Louis XVI will die. The monarchy is no longer just suspended, it is executed. As the carriage pulls Louis from the conciergerie, the former monarch walks with a strange, stoic dignity, his hands bound, wearing the blue coat of a common soldier. He does not plead for mercy, having already exhausted that right during his trial. Instead, he accepts the inevitable, whispering his famous last words, "Citizens, I die innocent and I forgive my judges." The scaffold awaits him, the guillotine standing as a mechanical monument to the people's sovereignty. The blade, a heavy steel blade known as la guillotine, hangs suspended, waiting to descend. When it falls, the king's head rolls into the basket. A shockwave of silence ripples through the crowd, followed by a roar of mixed triumph and confusion. The execution of Louis XVI marks the definitive death of the French monarchy. The old world is gone forever, replaced by a republic that is now at war with itself and the rest of Europe. Yet, the reign of terror is not yet over. In fact, it has only just begun its most brutal chapter. Just a month later, on October 16, 1793, the tragedy repeats itself on the same square. This time, the victim is Queen Marie Antoinette. Her journey to the scaffold was perhaps even more harrowing than her husband's. Once the object of vicious satire and the villain in every revolutionary pamphlet, she was stripped of her title as Marion, reduced to a defendant in a court of public opinion and law. She stood trial not for leading an invasion of France, as the revolutionary propaganda claimed, but for conspiracy to overthrow the government, a charge built largely on fear and political expediency. The evidence was scant, the witnesses unreliable, yet the verdict was swift and certain. Marie Antoinette walked to the block with a fragile grace that belied the terror surrounding her. Unlike Louis, she did not speak during her final moments, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the horizon. As the blade descended, cutting through her neck, the crowd fell silent again. The execution of the Queen sent a chilling message throughout France and Europe. No one is safe in the new republic. Not even the royalty, not even the most beloved figures of the old regime. These two executions transformed the French Revolution from a political upheaval into a blood-soaked revolution of the people. The concept of the divine right of kings was not merely challenged. It was severed from the neck of history. The executions also served a terrifying purpose for the Jacobin leadership. By eliminating the symbols of the old order so decisively, the Committee of Public Safety aimed to crush any remaining royalist sympathies. However, the blood of the king and queen spilled onto the very soil that the revolutionaries claimed to liberate. It created a paradox that would haunt the revolution for years. The people had murdered their former sovereigns in the name of liberty, only to find that the violence they unleashed could not be easily controlled. The stage is now set for the Thermidorian reaction, where the bloodiest chapter of the terror will eventually turn inward. But for now, the shadows of Louis and Marie Antoinette loom large over the Republic, a reminder that the price of freedom had been paid in the currency of human life. The guillotine stands ready, and the blade waits for its next target. January 21, 1793, Place de la Révolution, Paris. The guillotine, a sleek iron apparatus disguised as a scaffold, had become the stage upon which the Republic performed its most brutal and terrifying drama. Following the execution of King Louis XVI, the machinery of state violence ground relentlessly into overdrive. The law of suspects, passed earlier in the year, had cast a net so wide that it ensnared not just aristocrats and clergy, but anyone merely suspected of royalist sympathies, hoarding grain, or simply lacking a revolutionary passport. Under the guidance of the Committee of Public Safety, led by the uncompromising Maximilien Robespierre, the Revolutionary Tribunal became a rubber stamp for death. It is estimated that between 16,000 and 40,000 people walked to the scaffold during this period, including former revolutionaries, generals, and ordinary citizens who failed to denounce their neighbors quickly enough. The atmosphere in Paris was one of perpetual fear. Families lived under the suspicion of one another, and the sight of the blade falling became the grim punctuation mark of daily life. This internal purging, however, was inextricably linked to the war raging on France's borders. By early 1793, the revolutionary zeal of the French people had terrified the monarchies of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Spain, and others formed the first coalition, vowing to crush the experiment before it spread. The French armies, once demoralized and poorly equipped, faced a desperate reality. The nation was under siege. Yet, paradoxically, the war effort revitalized the Republic. The plight of the frontier soldiers galvanized the peasantry and the urban poor, transforming their fear of foreign invasion into a fervent patriotism. This crisis birthed the levée en masse, the first modern draft, calling up every able-bodied man, woman, and child to serve in the army or support the home front. The revolutionary government realized that to survive, they had to fight with a total commitment that mirrored their internal ruthlessness. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer from Corsica, rose to prominence during this period, not for heroism in the traditional sense, but for the sheer tactical efficiency he brought to the defense of the Republic. He saved Toulon from the British, a victory that secured his reputation and hinted at the military genius that would soon dominate European history. As 1793 drew to a close, the war against Europe intensified. The coalition forces pushed deep into French soil, threatening Paris itself. The Republic responded with an army of enraged patriots, a force driven by the promise of liberty and the terror of the enemy. The conflict was no longer just a war for territory. It was an ideological struggle to the death. The streets of Paris remained filled with the echoes of the guillotine, while the fields turned red with the blood of conscripted farmers defending their new homeland. The terror had begun as a measure to save the revolution from counter-revolutionaries, but it quickly metastasized into a total war of extermination. The line between the citizen and the soldier blurred. Both were expected to die for the Republic if necessary. The nation became a fortress, sealed off from the outside world, united by a singular, bloody purpose. As the year ended, the coalition's armies were pushed back, not merely by superior French numbers, but by the terrifying determination of a people who believed their existence depended on the outcome of the battlefield. The war against Europe had forced the revolution to harden its edges, forging a new kind of citizen soldier and setting the stage for the global spread of revolutionary violence. The blood on the cobblestones of Paris had mixed with the mud of the northern French frontier, creating a legacy of conflict that would echo through the 19th century. May 8, 1794, Paris. The air in the National Convention is thick with the scent of fear and the taste of impending blood. For over a year, the guillotine has been the city's most constant companion, a symbol of the reign of terror orchestrated by Maximilien Robespierre and his inner circle, the Committee of Public Safety. But as the summer sun beats down on the Tuileries, the revolution is turning inward. The hunger of the people has been eased by the harvest. The armies are winning battles abroad. Yet, inside the Palais Bourbon, the Jacobin dictatorship is suffocating the very nation it claims to save. The turning point arrives on the night of July 26, 1794, in the heat of the Thermidor season, the final month of the old Republican calendar. A secret gathering of deputies, known as the Friends of the Cordeliers, begins to circulate a rumor that Robespierre has ordered the execution of several moderate deputies. These deputies are not merely reacting to a threat. They are terrified for their lives and for the soul of the revolution they helped create. They see a leader who has become a god, demanding absolute worship while silencing all dissent. The atmosphere in the convention is electric with conspiracy. The room is packed, not with the usual orderly proceedings, but with a chaotic thrumming of whispers and urgent movements. Robespierre is a man of principle who believes terror is the only way to defend the virtue of the Republic. He refuses to compromise, insisting that any deviation from the strict revolutionary path is a betrayal of the people. He speaks with a voice of cold conviction, dismissing the accusations against him as lies spun by his enemies. He does not realize that he has alienated every faction in the room. The Girondins are dead, but the moderates, the mountain radicals, and the plain Republicans are now united in a single, deadly goal: to stop the killing. At 7:00 p.m. on the morning of July 27, the trap snaps shut. The session of the convention begins as scheduled. Robespierre enters the hall expecting to defend himself against his old enemies. Instead, he finds a united front. When he rises to speak, he is met not with applause but with silence. Then the shouting begins. Deputies shout for his arrest. To prison, cries one voice, soon echoed by hundreds. Robespierre, realizing too late that he has been isolated, attempts to leave the hall. He is immediately surrounded by National Guardsmen and arrested on the spot. It is a swift, surgical strike. Within hours, his brother, Augustin, and his close allies Saint-Just and Couthon are also dragged from their homes. By evening, the mood shifts from terror to a grim sense of relief. The convention passes a decree abolishing the Revolutionary Tribunal and stopping the mass executions. The storm of the terror has broken. The next morning, July 28, the fate of the great man is sealed. Maximilien Robespierre and his companions are taken to the Place de la Révolution. The scaffold, once a symbol of revolutionary justice, now stands as the monument to the end of the terror. With a final look of defiant silence, Robespierre climbs the steps. As the blade falls, the head of the most feared man in Europe rolls into the basket. The crowd does not cheer, they breathe. The fall of Robespierre marks the abrupt end of the most radical phase of the revolution. It is a testament to the fragility of absolute power and the relentless drive of the human spirit to survive. The bloodshed slows, the drums of war fade into the background, and France stands on a precipice, ready to transition from the chaos of the terror to the instability of the Thermidorian reaction. The revolution has survived its most dangerous leader, but the question remains: what will come next when the axe is lowered? April 20, 1792, Paris. The air in the Tuileries Palace is thick not just with the humidity of a spring morning, but with the palpable tension of a kingdom teetering on the brink. Inside, King Louis XVI signs the decree that will shatter the fragile peace of the early revolution. France declares war on Austria. This single signature does not merely mark the beginning of a military campaign. It ignites a conflagration that will engulf the entire continent and drag France into its most brutal internal and external struggles. The decision was born of desperation and paranoia. Although France had attempted to secure its borders diplomatically, the Austrian Emperor, Francis II, refused to recognize the revolutionary changes in France. He viewed the abolition of feudalism and the execution of royal authority as an existential threat to the European monarchic order. Consequently, Austria mobilized its armies, and soon Prussia, Sweden, Spain, Sardinia, and eventually the Dutch Republic joined the fray. Together, they formed the First Coalition, a massive alliance dedicated to crushing the French Republic and restoring the Bourbons to their throne. The declaration of war is the catalyst that transforms the French Revolution from a domestic political upheaval into a total war of ideology. The National Assembly, now firmly under the control of the more radical Girondins, believed that war was necessary to spread the principles of liberty and to distract the hungry Parisian masses from their economic grievances. They argued that an external enemy would force the French people to unite behind the Republic. However, the reality on the ground was far more chaotic. The French army was in disarray. Many officers were nobles who had lost their titles and wealth, while the conscripts were peasants and workers with little to no military training. The contrast between the professional, well-equipped armies of the coalition and the ragged French levies was stark. Yet, the very weakness of the French defense galvanized the spirit of the revolution. The realization that France was at war with the entire known world forced a radicalization of the political landscape. The moderate factions were swept aside, and the radical Jacobins, led by figures like Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, began to take center stage. As the coalition armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into French territory, the fear of invasion became the primary fuel for domestic terror. The prospect of foreign armies marching on Paris convinced the revolutionaries that the nation was under siege not just by kings, but by an existential evil. This narrative of siege was crucial in justifying the suspension of civil liberties and the rise of the Reign of Terror. The war created a perpetual state of emergency, where the definition of a patriot and a traitor became fluid and often lethal. It is impossible to discuss the war without acknowledging the deep divisions it exacerbated within France itself. While the central government in Paris rallied around the banner of the Republic, a significant portion of the rural population, particularly in the Vendée region, refused to support the war against the king and the church. The conflict with the First Coalition thus sowed the seeds of the catastrophic civil war that would follow. By the summer of 1792, the military situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Austrian and Prussian forces, confident in their superior discipline, threatened Paris directly. The sight of foreign uniforms approaching the city gates triggered the most violent days of the Revolution. On July 14, 1792, the fall of the Bastille had been celebrated as a victory, but now the streets of Paris ran red again, not in celebration but in fear. The war proved to be the crucible in which the old republic was forged into something far more terrifying, the Republic in arms. The conflict with the First Coalition did not merely threaten the survival of the French state. It fundamentally altered the nature of governance, law, and human rights within France. The war against Europe became a war against humanity itself, setting the stage for the Reign of Terror and the eventual rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. March 1793, the sleepy coastal village of Machical, Vendée. While Paris burned with the rhetoric of the Jacobins and the guillotine stood ready for the king, A different kind of fire was kindling in the western provinces of France. It was not a fire of ideological enlightenment, but one of religious fervor, local pride, and deep-seated hatred for the new secular order. The civil war in the Vendée had begun, a brutal uprising that would come to symbolize the darkest capacity for violence within the French Revolution itself. The roots of this rebellion lay in the very policies designed to save the Republic. In late 1792, the National Assembly had passed the civil constitution of the clergy, forcing priests to swear an oath of loyalty to the state rather than to the Pope. In the deeply Catholic Vendée, where tradition reigned supreme, this was seen as heresy. When the convention demanded conscription in late January 1793 to fill the ranks of the armies fighting the First Coalition, the Vendians viewed it as a betrayal of their faith and their liberty. They refused to fight for a republic that demanded they abandon God. On March 10, 1793, a small force of royalist peasants, led by Jean-Baptiste Delbé and François de Charette, marched on Massicault. When the royalist column arrived, they found a scene of utter devastation. The local National Guard, loyal to Paris, had already been purged or fled. In their absence, the royalists took the town, marking the official start of a massive popular insurrection that would swell to include 50,000 men. The nature of this rebellion was distinct from the political upheavals of Paris. It was a peasant war, fueled by a desire to restore the monarchy and the traditional order. However, as the conflict dragged on into the spring and summer of 1793, the revolutionaries in Paris could not afford a soft approach. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, viewed the Vendée not as a misguided rebellion, but as an existential threat that had to be crushed with total annihilation. This decision would birth the concept of depopulation as a military strategy, a policy of terror so severe it would eventually turn against the revolution itself. By June 1793, the Vendian army had grown into a formidable force of nearly 50,000, supported by local populations who refused to feed the Republican armies. They wore homemade uniforms, their tricolor cockades replaced by the black cockade of the Vendée, and their horses painted black to signify mourning for the lost old order. Yet, they were vastly outmatched by the Republican regulars. The turning point came at the Battle of Collet in October 1793. A massive Republican column, numbering over 40,000, crushed the Vendian forces in a bloodbath. Thousands of royalists were killed, wounded, or captured. But the war did not end with the defeat at Collet. Instead, it descended into a horrific campaign of mutual destruction. The Republican commanders, including Jean-Baptiste Kleber and Charles-François Dumouriez, were given orders to wipe out the resistance completely. The infamous law of suspects was applied with terrifying efficiency. Entire villages were burned to the ground, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered to prevent the Vendeans from surviving. Thousands of prisoners, including women, children, and the elderly, were marched in long columns to execution sites. The massacre at Noirmoutier and the deportations to the island of Ile d'Yeu became infamous episodes of the war. The brutality was not merely military, it was societal. The Vendée became a zone of no return, where the distinction between soldier and civilian vanished. The Royalists, once defenders of their homes, often turned to desperate measures, including the destruction of Republican sympathizers. In a grim twist, the revolution had created its own monster, a force that committed atrocities far surpassing those of the king's enemies. This internal civil war drained the Republic's resources, stretched its armies thin, and forced Paris to adopt a level of paranoia and violence that would define the Reign of Terror. By 1794, the rebellion was quelled. The Vendée was effectively depopulated, with an estimated 100,000 people dead, either in battle, from disease, starvation, or summary execution. The land was scarred and the community shattered. The Civil War in the Vendée served as a grim reminder that the French Revolution was not merely a battle between France and foreign powers, but a struggle that tore the French people apart from the inside. It proved that the pursuit of liberty, when pursued without mercy, could descend into a nightmare of dehumanization, leaving a legacy of trauma that would haunt the region for generations. July 27, 1794, Paris. The air in the National Convention was thick with the scent of fear and the lingering blood of the guillotine. After 23 months of unchecked violence, where thousands had been sacrificed to the altar of virtue, the pendulum of history swung violently back. The Thermidorian reaction had begun, not as a revolution, but as a desperate attempt by the moderates within the convention to save their own skins from Robespierre's inevitable purge. The moment marked the end of the Reign of Terror, signaling the collapse of the Jacobin dictatorship and the rise of a new, chaotic political order. For months, Maximilien Robespierre had ruled through the Committee of Public Safety, viewing himself as the sole guardian of the revolution against internal and external enemies. He declared that the Republic in arms was the only form of government possible, leading to the law of suspects, which swept up anyone deemed a royalist or a counter-revolutionary. But his paranoia bred his undoing. As the harvest failed and the war effort faltered, the convention grew weary of the bloodbath. Fearing that Robespierre intended to make himself a king by other means, a coalition of moderate deputies, known as the Thermidorians, united against the incorruptible. They were not monsters themselves, but men terrified of becoming the next victims of the guillotine. The turning point came when Robespierre failed to rally his allies during the convention session. Instead of his usual supporters, the deputies demanded his arrest. As he attempted to speak, the room fell into a stunned silence, followed by shouts of "Down with the tyrant" and "Vive la liberté." He fled, only to be captured almost immediately and dragged to the scaffold alongside his closest ally, Saint Just. Within hours, the machine of terror was switched off. The Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed, and the death penalty for counter-revolutionary activities was suspended. The Committee of Public Safety was dissolved, and its members faced trial or flight. The era of revolutionary justice had ended, replaced by a thirst for peace, property rights, and personal safety. In the aftermath, France descended into a political vacuum. The radical Jacobins were purged, but so too were many of their opponents, leading to a period of confusion known as the White Terror, where former royalists sought retribution against the sans-culottes. To stabilize the nation, the convention voted to replace the First Republic with a 5-member executive body called the Directory. Established in November 1795, this new government was designed to be a moderate compromise between the extremes of the Jacobins and the Royalists. It consisted of 2 councils, the Ancients and the 500, and a directory of 5 directors who held executive power. The Constitution of the year III strictly limited the powers of the executive, aiming to prevent any single leader from dominating the state. However, the Directory was plagued from the start by inherent weaknesses. The legislative councils, swollen with members, became gridlocked, often refusing to pass budgets or laws. Corruption ran rampant, High salaries for directors and officials attracted wealthy opportunists who viewed public office as a golden ticket for personal gain rather than public service. Meanwhile, the countryside remained unsettled by the memory of the civil war in the Vendée, and the economy was in ruins due to inflation and the collapse of the assignats. The instability of the Directory created a perfect breeding ground for further insurrection. By 1797, the government was so weak that it faced threats from both left and right. The Royalists, emboldened by the fall of the Jacobins, attempted to seize power in the coup of 18 Fructidor, but they were crushed by the National Guard, an event that demonstrated the military's growing political influence. As the Directory wavered under the weight of foreign invasion and internal unrest, the stage was set for the final act of the revolution. The promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been buried under a pile of bodies, and a regime of corruption, leaving France desperate for a strong hand to restore order. The door was now open, not for a return to monarchy, but for the rise of a new kind of leader who would wield the power of the Republic without its democratic constraints. September 26, 1795. Paris. The air in the Tuileries Palace is thick with the scent of wet wool and political cynicism, a stark contrast to the fiery idealism that had swept the streets just 2 years prior. Following the bloody collapse of the Reign of Terror and the execution of Robespierre, France was left in a desperate vacuum. The Thermidorian reaction had cleared the radicals, but it had not cleared the chaos. The nation was starving, the economy was shattered, and the borders were bleeding under the weight of a coalition of European monarchs. Into this maelstrom stepped the Directory, a five-man executive body designed to be a moderate, stable bridge between the monarchy and the republic. In theory, the Directory was a triumph of compromise. It was a government of the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, who finally held the reins of power. The Constitution of Year III established a bicameral legislature to prevent the mob rule that had plagued the previous assemblies. The Council of 500 drafted laws, while the Council of Ancients reviewed them, creating a system of checks and balances intended to stifle both the radicalism of the Jacobins and the conservatism of the Royalists. It was, on paper, the most representative government the world had ever seen. Yet the reality in the streets of Paris was nothing like the parchment in the Tuileries. The Directory was not a government of liberty. It was a government of survival, and quickly it became a government of corruption. The financial crisis was catastrophic. The assignats, the paper money that had once been the symbol of revolutionary hope, were now worthless rags, driving the economy into hyperinflation. To pay the army and keep the administration running, the directors resorted to selling off the church lands and the national palaces at a fraction of their value. It was a blatant auction of the nation's soul, enriching a small circle of speculators, while the common citizen could not afford a loaf of bread. The directors themselves, men like Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and Paul Barras, were often more interested in securing their own fortunes and power than in serving the Republic. They were known to take bribes, engage in shady trading deals, and use state funds for personal gain. The military, once the instrument of the revolution, had become a political patronage machine. Generals were appointed based on loyalty and bribery rather than merit, leading to a bloated, inefficient army that struggled against the First Coalition. This weakness created a perfect storm for insurrection. By 1795, the French people were exhausted. The war was dragging on, the economy was collapsing, and the promise of the revolution seemed like a distant joke. The political climate was volatile, swinging wildly between the fear of a royalist counter-revolution and the threat of a new Jacobin uprising. The Directory found itself constantly playing one faction against another, unable to govern effectively because it lacked the authority to enforce its own will. The situation reached a breaking point in May 1795. A coalition of royalists and moderate patriots attempted a coup, known as the Coup of 13 Vendémiaire. They marched on the Tuileries hoping to install a constitutional monarchy. The directors, terrified of repeating the violence of the past, called for the National Guard. But it was the young artillery commander, Napoleon Bonaparte, who stood on the ramparts of the Tuileries. With a simple command and a shower of grapeshot into the crowd, he quelled the rebellion in hours, sparing the city further bloodshed but silencing dissent. The victory was hollow. While the Directory survived another day, its legitimacy was mortally wounded. It had saved its own skin with the help of a general who had more power than the government itself, using violence that the Directory claimed to despise. The narrative of the government of the people crumbled under the weight of its own corruption and impotence. The stage was set for the ultimate conclusion, a republic in name only, where a single man would rise to seize control, ending the era of chaos and ushering in the dictatorship that would define the rest of the century. The Directory did not die of old age. It was assassinated by the very instability it failed to control, paving the way for the year without a king. May 12, 1795, Paris. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and unspent powder. For nearly 3 years, the French Republic has been a graveyard of ideals, where the guillotine claimed the king, and the sans-culottes claimed the rights of the people, only to find themselves replaced by the very corruption they swore to destroy. Following the Thermidorian reaction, the moderate Directory seized control, promising order and stability. They offered amnesty to royalists and a return to economic normalcy. But they failed to understand the fundamental truth of Paris. The people would starve before they would starve in freedom. The Directory's greatest error was not political, it was logistical. They neglected the national treasury, leaving the state insolvent and the army unpaid. When the government cut off the distribution of grain, the price of bread soared to levels that defied the wages of the common laborer. By the spring of 1795, Paris was on the brink of total collapse, a city held together by nothing more than the fragile hope that the new rulers would listen. The unrest began not with a bang, but with a rumble of hunger. The working-class districts of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and the Faubourg Saint-Marcel became boiling pots of resentment. The workers, known as the enragés, saw in the Directory not their liberators, but a new aristocracy of speculators and bankers hoarding wealth while they gnawed on rind. The political atmosphere was equally volatile. The Royalists, emboldened by the chaos, plotted a counter-revolution in the Vendée and Brittany, while the Jacobins, still haunted by the memory of the Terror, whispered of restoring the Republic to its radical roots. The Directory, paralyzed by internal bickering and terrified of sparking another civil war, attempted to suppress the movement through decrees that proved useless without enforcement. They needed force, but the regular army was demoralized and unpaid. The only loyal force remained the National Guard, but even they were fracturing under the strain of inflation and political polarization. As May turned into June, the situation escalated into outright insurrection. On June 20, a massive crowd gathered at the Palais Royal, the center of political life, demanding bread and the recall of their former leaders. When the Directory refused to negotiate, the mob turned to violence. They marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the Directory resided, shouting slogans that echoed the old revolutionary fervor, though now directed against the current government. The National Guard initially hesitated, but when the mob broke through the barricades and threatened to burn the palace down, the Guard finally intervened to restore order, firing upon the crowds. But the bloodletting was not enough to quell the spirit of the people. By June 22, the insurrection had reignited with even greater fury. This time, the mob was not just protesting. They were preparing to overthrow the government entirely. The climax of the crisis arrived on June 23. Thousands of armed insurgents, carrying pikes and muskets, marched on the Tuileries again. They were led by figures from the radical left, demanding the abdication of the Directory and the establishment of a new convention. The Directory, facing annihilation, made a desperate gamble. They did not try to fight a losing battle with bayonets. Instead, they appealed to the moderates, the bourgeoisie, and the wealthy citizens of Paris, who had suffered alongside the workers under the economic collapse. A coalition was formed in the streets, a strange alliance of the rich and the poor united against the chaos. When the mob reached the gates of the Tuileries, they found the gates locked, defended not by the Directory's weak guards, but by a determined militia of shopkeepers, bankers, and former aristocrats. The mob was repelled, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The failure of the Parisian insurrection of 1795 revealed the fatal flaw of the revolution. It could not reconcile the demands of the people with the needs of the economy, nor could it unite the fractured political factions. The Directory survived, but it was weakened forever. The promise of bread had been broken, the trust in republican institutions eroded, and the stage was set for a new kind of leadership, one that would not hesitate to use the power of the state to impose order from above. The Republic had lost its soul to the very chaos it sought to prevent, setting the world stage for the rise of a man who would claim to be the savior of the revolution, even as he destroyed its democratic foundations. November 9, 1799, Paris. The city, weary from nearly a decade of political turbulence, stood on the precipice of a new order. France had slipped from the chaotic idealism of the Jacobins into the corrupt, ineffective stagnation of the Directory. The government was paralyzed by factional infighting, rampant corruption, and the constant threat of royalist counter-revolutions, all while foreign armies pressed against the borders. In this atmosphere of exhaustion and uncertainty, the stage was set for the most pivotal moment in the history of modern France, the coup of 18 Brumaire. At the center of this power shift stood Napoleon Bonaparte. By late 1799, he was not yet the emperor of legend, but a highly respected military hero. Having returned from a triumphant campaign in Egypt, where he had defeated the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of the Nile, Napoleon was a man whose sword had secured the nation's borders. Yet, as a general, he felt the limits of his influence. The Directory, composed of 5 directors, viewed him with suspicion, fearing his growing popularity. Napoleon, sensing the fragility of the Republic and perhaps the inevitability of a strong executive, decided that the time for decisive action had arrived. The coup unfolded with the precision of a military operation disguised as a legal maneuver. Napoleon, who had already been named first consul of the 3-consul executive, orchestrated the event with the help of 2 key allies: the young lawyer Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who had grown disillusioned with the Directory, and General Jean Laharpe. Their plan was to dissolve the existing government and install a new constitution that would consolidate power in the hands of a single leader. The date chosen, 18 Brumaire of the year VIII, marked the beginning of the uprising. Napoleon arrived in Paris under the pretext of inspecting the National Guard, a move designed to create a diversion. While he was ostensibly away, his brother Joseph Bonaparte, a trusted diplomat, pressured the Directory directors into resigning. Before the end of the day, the Directory was dissolved, and the Senate was convened to oversee the transfer of power. However, the transition was not entirely peaceful. When the Senate refused to ratify the proposed new constitution, the real conflict began. Napoleon, accompanied by a cavalry regiment led by General Berthier and the artillery commander Murat, marched on the Senate House. The scene inside the chamber was tense and chaotic. The senators, many of them royalists or defenders of the old order, barricaded themselves behind glass tables, refusing to vote. It was here that Napoleon's ruthlessness was displayed. According to the famous account, Napoleon ordered his soldiers to clear the room. When the senators resisted, the troops smashed the glass tables with the flat of their swords and bayoneted those who stood in the way. It was a brutal display of force that signaled the end of parliamentary debate. The Senate, terrified and defeated, voted to ratify the new constitution. The result was the establishment of the consulate. While Napoleon was technically one of 3 consuls, the Constitution granted him the power of the first consul, giving him the ability to choose his successors and control the foreign ministry and the army. The other 2 consuls, Roger Ducos and Cambaceres, were merely figureheads. The republic existed in name only. The reality was a dictatorship born from the ashes of the revolution. This event marked the definitive end of the revolutionary experiment in direct democracy and the beginning of the Napoleonic era. The chaos of the Directory was replaced by stability, order, and efficient administration. Napoleon's rise to power was not just a change of government. It was the culmination of the revolution's promise for a strong state, achieved through the ultimate exercise of force. As the sun set over Paris on November 9, 1799, the world watched as the French Republic quietly transformed into the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, setting the stage for the conflicts that would dominate European history for the next 20 years. December 2, 1799, in the grand halls of the Palais Royal, Paris. The air was thick with the scent of damp marble and the electric tension of a nation exhausted by 8 years of chaos. It had been a decade since the storm broke at the Bastille, and a mere 2 years since the guillotine fell silent on the Thermidorian reaction. The French people, weary of the Directory's corruption, military coups, and constant instability, stood on the precipice of a new era. They had voted for liberty and republicanism, yet they found themselves drowning in factionalism and administrative paralysis. What they demanded was not more debate, but order. What they needed was a strong hand to steer the ship of state through the storms of foreign invasion and internal rebellion. Into this vacuum of power stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, a general who had saved the Republic by defeating the Austrians at Marengo, a man whose military genius had become the very shield protecting the fragile experiment of 1789. On that fateful Tuesday, amidst the whispers of the elite and the hopeful murmurs of the masses, Napoleon delivered a speech that would echo through history, framing his coup not as an overthrow of the Republic, but as a necessary defense of it. He spoke of the year without a king that had become a year without a government capable of governing. He promised stability, security, and the restoration of France's national dignity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The legislature, terrified of a military dictatorship and the return of the Jacobins, dissolved itself in a panic. Napoleon, seizing the initiative, declared himself the sole ruler in the name of the nation. This was the coup of 18 Brumaire, a bloodless revolution that ended the chaotic decade of the Directory and birthed the Consulate. The structure of the new government was meticulously designed to centralize authority while maintaining the veneer of the Republic. Napoleon did not appoint himself king. He appointed himself first consul, effectively making him the master of all three consuls who ruled jointly. However, this was a sham. The Constitution of the year VIII, drafted by Sieyès and ratified by Napoleon, established a first consul with absolute power. He alone appointed all ministers, judges, and mayors. He alone commanded the army, and he alone initiated legislation. The other two consuls were reduced to figureheads, a deliberate move to prevent the resurgence of parliamentary gridlock. The legislative bodies remained, but their power was neutered. The tribunate could only discuss laws without voting on them, and the legislative body could only register the decisions of the executive. The Senate, a body of 75 members appointed for life by the first consul, held the sole power to initiate constitutional amendments and appoint officials to the tribunate and legislative body. In essence, the executive branch swallowed the legislative and judicial branches whole. This centralization was the consulate's greatest strength and its most controversial feature. It replaced the paralyzing bureaucracy of the Directory with a streamlined, efficient administration. Napoleon understood that a vast nation like France could not be governed by committees and endless debates. He needed a unified command. By concentrating power in a single individual, he ensured that decisions could be made and executed with unprecedented speed. Corruption was curbed, as the first consul controlled the purse strings and the appointment of civil servants. The chaotic local governments were brought under strict central control, ensuring that laws passed in Paris were actually enforced in the provinces. This administrative efficiency laid the groundwork for the modern French state, transforming a patchwork of feudal remnants into a cohesive national entity. Yet this consolidation of power came at a cost. The spirit of the 1793 revolution, with its emphasis on popular sovereignty and active citizenship, began to suffocate under the weight of imperial ambition. The revolution had promised that the people would rule, but now the people were being ruled by one man. The promise of the Republic was preserved in name, but the reality was a dictatorship in waiting. Napoleon had silenced the radicalism that had plagued the Directory, but he had also silenced the dissent that might have checked his growing power. The consulate was a government of order, but it was an order imposed from above. As the sun set on the Palais Royal in late 1799, the era of the Republic was drawing to a close, replaced by the quiet, calculated rise of a man who would soon wear the crown he had once been so instrumental in destroying. The centralization of authority was complete. The path to empire had been cleared, and France, for better or worse, had found its new master. November 9, 1799, marked a turning point not just for France, but for the concept of democracy itself, as the story unfolded in the shadowed corridors of the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Following the chaotic and corrupt tenure of the Directory, which had struggled to maintain order amidst foreign invasions and domestic insurrection, the French people found themselves longing for stability. Into this vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, a general whose military genius had secured the borders of France, and who now sought to reshape the nation's political architecture. The stage was set for the coup of 18 Brumaire, a maneuver that would effectively dismantle the revolutionary republic and replace it with an authoritarian regime disguised as a constitutional government. In the immediate aftermath of seizing power, Napoleon and his allies, including the influential Abbé Sieyès and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, turned their attention to drafting a new constitution. The result was the Constitution of the Year VIII, approved in December 1799, which ostensibly preserved the Chinese letter of the Republic while gutting its democratic soul. The document declared France a republic, maintaining the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity, yet it systematically concentrated all executive power in the hands of a single individual, the first consul. While the first and second consuls existed in name only, wielding negligible authority, Napoleon held the reins of government as the supreme executive, responsible for foreign policy, war, and the administration of the state. The legislative branch was similarly neutered to ensure compliance with the new order. The Constitution established a bicameral legislature consisting of the tribunate and the legislative body. However, these bodies were designed to be mere talking shops. The tribunate, which could only debate proposed laws without the power to vote, was composed of 100 members appointed by the government. The legislative body, which held the power to vote on laws, was also appointed by the government and could not initiate legislation, only approve what was presented to them. This structure created a parliament with the appearance of deliberation, but devoid of any genuine independence or ability to challenge the first consul's decrees. Perhaps most concerning was the method of electing the representatives themselves. The Constitution of the Year VIII did not rely on direct suffrage for the national legislature. Instead, it utilized a complex system of indirect voting based on a census, where only wealthy taxpayers could vote. This effectively excluded the vast majority of the French population, including the peasantry and the working class, from the political process. By restricting the electorate to a narrow, propertied elite, Napoleon ensured that the new government would reflect the interests of the state and the military rather than the will of the people. The revolutionary ideal of universal male suffrage, fought for with such bloodshed, was quietly abandoned. Furthermore, the Constitution of the Year VIII stripped the judiciary of its independence. Judges were now appointed by the first consul rather than elected, turning the courts into instruments of the executive branch. This centralization extended to the local level as well, where prefects, appointed directly by Napoleon, oversaw every department in France, reporting straight to Paris and bypassing local mayors entirely. The result was a unified, centralized state where local autonomy was eradicated, and dissent was swiftly crushed by a loyal bureaucracy. On paper, France remained a republic, a beacon of the ideals that had toppled a monarchy. Yet in practice, the Republic of the Year VIII was a republic in name only. It was a facade erected to legitimize a dictatorship, masking the reality of absolute executive control under the banner of constitutional law. Napoleon had successfully engineered a transition from the chaos of revolution to the order of empire, proving that the new constitution was not a gift from the people, but a blueprint imposed upon them. As the ink dried on the Constitution of the Year VIII, the age of the French Republic was officially over, and the long march toward Napoleon's empire had begun in earnest. October 1795, Paris. Following the collapse of the Directory, France was teetering on the brink of civil war once again. The political elite had grown weary of the constant turmoil, economic stagnation, and the chaotic influence of the sans-culottes. Into this fractured vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte. Just 2 years prior, he had been a celebrated but relatively young artillery general. Now, at 28, he had ascended from a military commander to the de facto ruler of the French Republic, a transformation driven less by democratic mandate and more by sheer military brilliance and political opportunism. The catalyst for Napoleon's ascent was the Second Coalition's invasion of Italy. In early 1796, the French government appointed him commander of the Army of Italy. It was a gamble, but it paid off spectacularly. Within 18 months, Napoleon defeated a combined Austrian and Piedmontese army that outnumbered his forces, capturing Milan, Turin, and Venice. He did not merely conquer territory. He reorganized the societies he occupied, abolishing feudal privileges and implementing revolutionary ideals. By the time he returned to Paris in December 1797, he was not just a victorious general, but a national hero. The streets of Paris welcomed him with a fervor that the Directory could no longer suppress. By late 1799, the political situation in Paris had deteriorated into insolvency and street violence. The Directory, paralyzed by internal corruption and external threats, sought a savior. Napoleon, recognizing the moment, began maneuvering behind the scenes. He secured the support of key members of the Directory, most notably Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, and cultivated alliances within the National Assembly. The stage was set for a final act of power consolidation. On November 9, 1799, which corresponds to the 18th day of Brumaire under the Republican calendar, Napoleon addressed the Council of Ancients. His speech was brief and pointed. He accused the government of incompetence and claimed that the constitution of the year III was incompatible with the safety of the Republic. He demanded the dissolution of the government. The opposition, led by General Jean Lannes, initially tried to resist, but the tide quickly turned. Napoleon's artillery was positioned outside the Assembly Hall, a silent threat that silenced dissent. As the deputies hesitated, Napoleon, often referred to as Brumaire Napoleon by historians, seized the initiative. He and his allies arrested the remaining members of the Directory, effectively ending the experiment with representative government that had lasted since 1795. This bloodless coup d'etat marked the definitive end of the First Republic's democratic phase. In the aftermath, a provisional executive committee was established to govern France until a new constitution could be written. This period, known as the Consulate, was designed to stabilize the nation. On December 2, 1799, the new constitution of the year VIII was adopted. It fundamentally altered the structure of the state. While it maintained the facade of a republic with elected bodies, real power was concentrated in the hands of 3 individuals known as the consuls. However, the balance of power was heavily skewed. The first consul was Napoleon himself, who held the sole authority to draft laws, appoint judges, and command the army. The second and third consuls were mere figureheads, with no independent power to check the first consul's decree. The Constitution of the year VIII legally codified Napoleon's status. It declared France a unified nation under the rule of the first consul, effectively creating a dictatorship disguised as a constitutional republic. With this new framework in place, Napoleon was no longer just a general or a hero. He was the architect of French governance. The chaos of the revolution had been quelled by the sword, and the instability of the Directory had been replaced by the iron will of a single leader. Napoleon's rise from a modest artillery officer to the first consul of France was complete. The Republic of 1799 was born, but it would serve as the prelude to the empire. The era of revolutionary experimentation had closed, and the age of Napoleonic hegemony had officially begun. November 9, 1799, Paris. The city is buzzing with a nervous energy that has defined the last decade of the First Republic. France is exhausted by 12 years of constant warfare, domestic terror, and political instability. The Directory, the ruling body that followed the reign of terror, has become synonymous with corruption, inefficiency, and foreign intervention. Amidst the chaos, a general named Napoleon Bonaparte returns from a successful campaign in Egypt, carrying the aura of a military savior. The French people, weary of the year without a king and the chaos of the street, are desperate for order, even if it means trading liberty for security. This moment marks the critical transition from the revolutionary experiment to the authoritarian rule that would soon define an era. The turning point arrives swiftly in the early hours of the morning on November 9. Napoleon, along with his brother-in-law Joseph Cambaceres and the politician Roger Ducos, orchestrates the coup of 18 Brumaire. It is not a bloody revolution in the traditional sense, but a calculated political maneuver. The Directory tries to resist, but their power base crumbles under the weight of the army's loyalty to the new leader. The Constitutional Committee, realizing the futility of opposition, eventually capitulates. In a dramatic scene at the Hôtel de Ville, the Constitutional Committee is forced to resign, handing over the keys of the Republic to the three conspirators. By evening, the coup is complete. The First Republic effectively ends, not with a bang, but with a quiet resignation that signals the end of parliamentary democracy in France. In its place rises the consulate, a new executive body designed to centralize authority and restore stability. Napoleon is elected as first consul, holding supreme power while the other two consuls serve merely as figureheads. This arrangement is enshrined in the Constitution of the year VIII, drafted by Napoleon himself and adopted on December 24, 1799. The Constitution presents itself as a republican framework, maintaining the principle of popular sovereignty in name, but the reality is a stark dictatorship. It abolishes the democratic elements of the Constitution of the year III, replacing the legislative councils with a system where the first consul holds the power to veto laws, appoint judges, and direct foreign policy. The spirit of the revolution is suffocated by the machinery of state control, yet the legal framework remains intact to preserve the gains of the revolution, such as religious tolerance and the abolition of feudalism. Under the consulate, France enters a period of intense centralization. Napoleon begins to dismantle the decentralized power structures that had plagued the Directory. He purges the administration of corrupt officials, replacing them with loyalists who understand the necessity of a strong hand. The economy, devastated by hyperinflation and war, begins to stabilize under his decisive management. However, the cost of this stability is high. Political dissent is crushed, and the press is heavily censored. The revolutionary ideal of civic participation is replaced by a culture of obedience to the state. Yet, for a population sickened by the violence of the terror and the incompetence of the Directory, this order feels like salvation. As the consulate solidifies its grip, the the path toward empire becomes inevitable. Napoleon's popularity grows with every military victory and every economic reform. He transforms the French army into a highly disciplined machine, ready for expansion. By 1804, the internal consolidation is complete, and the focus shifts entirely to external domination. The road to the empire is paved with the debris of the Republic. The Constitution of the year XII, enacted in 1804, formally ends the consulate and establishes the First French Empire. Napoleon is crowned emperor, not by the Pope in a traditional coronation, but by himself, symbolizing the complete transfer of divine right to personal ambition. The revolution, which began with the cry of liberty, equality, fraternity, culminates in an imperial monarchy that will redraw the map of Europe and spark centuries of conflict. The consulate was the bridge, the necessary evil that carried the fragile republic across the chasm of chaos to the heights of imperial power, leaving a legacy that is both brilliant in its administration and terrifying in its scope. August 24, 1804, Paris. The ink had barely dried on the declaration of the First French Empire, yet the most enduring gift Napoleon Bonaparte would leave to the world was not his military conquests or his imperial coronation, but a legal framework that would outlive his dynasty itself. Following the chaotic legal landscape of the late ancient regime, where feudal privileges were abolished but replaced by a confusing patchwork of local customs and royal decrees, the French nation needed stability. Under the guidance of his Minister of Justice, Jean-Jacques Régnier, and a team of brilliant jurists, Napoleon assembled a commission to draft a unified civil code. Their mission was clear: to codify the revolutionary principles of equality and liberty into a single, coherent legal text that would serve as the foundation of modern French society, and eventually the entire continent. The resulting document, known as the Civil Code, or simply the Napoleonic Code, was promulgated on March 21, 1804. It was a revolutionary act of legal engineering. Before this, French law was a chaotic mess of customary laws from different regions, Roman law and feudal statutes, often favoring the powerful and the landed elite. The code systematically dismantled this complexity. It abolished the remnants of feudalism that lingered from the past, ensuring that property rights were secular, and that the law applied equally to all citizens regardless of their birth. This was the realization of the Enlightenment ideal that the law should be a rational expression of natural rights, not the arbitrary will of a monarch or the privilege of a class. Central to the code's philosophy was the radical redefinition of the family and property. The old patriarchal structures of the nobility were replaced by a bourgeois vision of the family. The law established that the husband was the head of the household, granting him significant authority over his wife and children, and giving him the sole right to administer family property. While this reflected the conservative social values of the rising middle class and Napoleon's own views, it also cemented the concept of private property as a sacred right. No one could be deprived of their property except for public necessity and in the strict execution of due process. This provision was a direct response to the confiscations and seizures of the Revolutionary era, offering a guarantee that encouraged investment and economic stability. Perhaps most significantly, the code institutionalized the principle of meritocracy in law. Birth no longer determined one's legal status. Instead, social standing was now based on talent and hard work. The legal barriers between different professions were removed, allowing for a more fluid society where a lawyer or a merchant could rise through ability rather than lineage. This legal equality was revolutionary, as it legally cemented the social transformations of 1789, ensuring that the doors of opportunity remained open for the common man. The code also standardized civil law across France, creating a unified nation-state where a citizen in Lyon was subject to the same fundamental rights as a citizen in Brittany, fostering a sense of national identity that transcended regional loyalties. The impact of this document was immediate and global. Within a few years, the code was exported to the colonies and conquered territories, influencing legal systems from Louisiana in North America to parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. It served as a template for civil law codes worldwide, influencing the legal traditions of Germany, Japan, and Italy. Even in modern times, the core principles of the Napoleonic Code regarding individual rights, property ownership, and secular law remain the bedrock of civil law systems globally. Napoleon's legacy is often remembered through his battles, but it is the code that truly codified the spirit of the revolution, transforming the chaotic ideals of 1789 into a lasting legal reality. By turning the abstract concepts of liberty and equality into concrete, written law, Napoleon ensured that the French Revolution would not be forgotten, but rather, it would be built upon, shaping the legal architecture of the modern world for centuries to come. June 1789, Versailles. It was not merely the walls of the Château that held the first tremors of this seismic shift. The earthquake of ideas had already begun to travel. By the time the smoke of the Bastille cleared in Paris, the revolutionary fervor had transcended national boundaries, turning the French Revolution into a global catalyst. The rigid structures of the ancient Regime asterisk, which seemed so permanent to European monarchs, were suddenly exposed as fragile as parchment. As news of the fall of the Bastille traveled at the speed of horse-drawn carriages, it carried with it a terrifying message to the courts of Vienna, St. Petersburg, and London. The divine right of kings was dying, and the sovereignty of the nation was being born. The immediate reaction across the continent was one of panic and armed intervention. In July 1789, Austria and Prussia, the twin pillars of European conservatism, issued the Pillnitz Declaration, warning that any attack on the person of the King of France would be considered an attack on the legitimate rights of all sovereigns. However, fear is often the first step toward ideological conversion. In the Netherlands, the story of the revolution reached the rebellious provinces of the Low Countries, fueling existing separatist movements against Austrian rule. The Dutch patriots, inspired by the French demand for liberty, began to organize their own assemblies, drafting constitutions that mirrored the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The concept that a government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed was no longer a radical whisper. It was a rallying cry echoing through the streets of Brussels and Amsterdam. Further west, in the American colonies, the revolution found an unlikely but powerful ally. The United States, still grappling with its own unfinished constitutional project, looked to France with a mixture of admiration and concern. Yet, the intellectual exchange was profound. Thomas Jefferson and other American founding fathers had long been influenced by French Enlightenment thought, and now they witnessed the practical application of these theories. The French struggle against feudalism resonated deeply with the American fight against aristocratic privilege, strengthening the resolve of the young republic. Simultaneously, the French experience of radical democracy inspired debates within the American political sphere regarding the role of the people versus the elite, influencing the ongoing constitutional conventions and the fierce debates between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. As the years turned, the spread of these ideas accelerated, often fueled by the very chaos of the French wars. The concept of national citizenship, rather than feudal allegiance, began to dismantle the old order. In the Italian city-states, particularly in Modena and Milan, local patriots began to establish provisional governments, inspired by the fall of the Bastille. They abolished seigneuries, the feudal lands held by local lords, and attempted to implement equal taxation. The French Revolution acted as a virus of liberation, attacking the body politic of Europe wherever the old hierarchies attempted to hold firm. By 1792, the message had reached the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. In the Austrian Netherlands and even within the German states, secret societies and open clubs began to distribute pamphlets detailing the successes of the Third Estate. The idea that law should be universal and that rights were inherent, not granted by a monarch, began to take root in the minds of the peasantry and the rising bourgeoisie across the continent. The revolution was no longer just a French civil war. It had become a European revolution. Even in places where the revolution was suppressed by force, the ideas refused to die. They went underground, carried by exiles, soldiers, and merchants, planting seeds that would eventually sprout in the wake of Napoleon's conquests and the eventual collapse of the absolute monarchies in the 19th century. The French Revolution proved that once an idea of liberty is spoken, it cannot be unspoken, spreading beyond the borders of France to fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history. June 4, 1789, Versailles. The air inside the Grand Hall of the Château was thick with tension, not just from the clatter of glass and the rustle of silk, but from a profound, societal crack that had been widening for decades. For centuries, France had operated on the rigid logic of the ancient regime, a system where one's birth determined one's destiny and one's taxes. Today, that ancient order faced its most direct challenge not on a battlefield, but within the very walls of the monarchy itself. As the Third Estate transformed into the National Assembly and adopted the title Constituent Assembly, they did more than just claim political representation. They launched an existential assault on the social hierarchy that had defined Europe for millennia. The revolution was no longer merely about bread or taxes. It was about the very definition of man. The centerpiece of this social transformation was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in August of that same year. This document was a philosophical earthquake. By asserting that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, the Assembly effectively erased the legal distinction between the estates. No longer did the title of noble confer an inherent right to rule or to be exempt from the burdens of citizenship. The ancient caste system, which placed the clergy and nobility above the common people, was declared obsolete. This was the first blow to the aristocracy's divine right to privilege, replacing it with the concept of national sovereignty residing in the people. However, true social transformation requires more than just words on paper. It demands the dismantling of the economic foundations that supported aristocratic power. On August 4th, in a moment of revolutionary fever that historians call the Night of August 4, the National Assembly achieved what seemed impossible. In a series of rapid votes, the Assembly abolished feudalism. It was a chaotic and emotional scene where nobles, many of whom were weeping, signed away their rights to hunt, fish, and use mills, rights they had exercised for centuries without paying for them. The assembly declared that no serfdom would exist, that all citizens would have the right to cultivate land, and that all tithes and feudal dues would be abolished. This single night effectively destroyed the economic engine of the old regime, stripping the nobility of their private jurisdictions and their monopoly on certain professions. The impact of these reforms was immediate and visceral for the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of the population. For the first time in history, the legal barrier between the peasant and the lord was removed. A peasant could now own the land he farmed without fear of arbitrary seizure or forced labor, and he was no longer bound by the humiliating trappings of serfdom. The great manorial courts, which had served as instruments of local aristocratic justice, were dissolved and replaced by the new national tribunals. This shift did not just change the law, it changed the social fabric. It empowered the common citizen to challenge the authority of the local lord, shifting power from the castle to the village square. Yet the transition was not without resistance or nuance. While the legal privileges of the nobility were stripped away, their social status and wealth did not vanish overnight. Many nobles retained their vast estates, often buying them back from the state when they fell into debt, and they continued to hold positions of influence. However, the legal armor of the ancient regime was gone. A nobleman was no longer a legal caste. He was simply a wealthy citizen, subject to the same laws, the same taxes, and the same potential for prosecution as any merchant or artisan. The distinction was no longer about bloodline, but about individual merit and property, a concept that would fundamentally reshape French society for generations to come. By the end of 1789, the ghost of the aristocracy as a ruling class began to fade. The revolution had successfully transformed France from a kingdom of estates into a nation of citizens. It ended the era where a king ruled by the grace of God and a nobility ruled by the grace of birth, ushering in a new, albeit turbulent, era where power was theoretically derived from the consent of the governed. The end of aristocratic privilege was not a gentle reform. It was a radical surgery on the heart of French society, leaving scars that would bleed for decades, but ultimately healing into a modern democratic framework. July 12, 1790, Paris. In the wake of the storm that toppled the Bastille, a quieter but equally seismic shift began to reshape the soul of France. The revolution had shattered the political structures of the ancient regime, but it left the nation's spiritual foundations in ruins. The church, once the bedrock of French identity and the primary landowner, was viewed by many not as a sacred institution, but as a pillar of the oppressive old order. To secure the loyalty of the clergy and integrate the church into the new nation-state, the National Assembly enacted the civil constitution of the clergy. This law fundamentally transformed the Catholic Church in France, turning its priests into paid state employees rather than independent servants of God. It mandated that bishops and parish priests be elected by local citizens, and that they swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and the King. This requirement created a deep and immediate fracture, splitting the clergy into two factions: the constitutional priests who accepted the state's authority, and the refractory, or non-jurors, who refused to compromise their vows to the Pope. The tension was palpable. When Pope Pius VI condemned the civil constitution in 1791, he was excommunicating not just a few rebellious bishops, but hundreds of thousands of French Catholics who felt betrayed by their government. This schism was a disaster for the revolution's claim to religious tolerance. Instead of uniting the populace under a banner of liberty, the state's interference in ecclesiastical affairs drove many faithful citizens back toward the monarchy and the church, fueling royalist resistance. Yet, the trajectory of religious policy continued to spiral into extremism. As the revolution radicalized during the Reign of Terror, the concept of tolerance was ironically weaponized. The cult of reason emerged as a state-sponsored atheism, mocking religious symbols and burning church organs. But this was not merely political radicalism. It was a genuine, albeit short-lived, attempt to forge a new civic religion based on reason rather than dogma. Even after Robespierre fell, the state remained suspicious of traditional religion. The Directory, the unstable government that followed the terror, passed the law of the year II in 1795. On paper, this law promised freedom of worship for all sects, effectively legalizing Protestantism and Judaism for the first time in centuries. However, the practical reality was one of profound indifference. The state refused to rebuild churches that had been destroyed or repurposed, leaving thousands of communities without a place of worship. For the revolutionary leadership, religion was a private matter, but the public square remained dominated by the logic of the Republic, which often viewed traditional piety with deep suspicion. It would not be until Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power that a true synthesis of religious freedom and state control would be achieved. His Concordat of 1801 finally healed the wounds of the civil constitution, restoring the Catholic Church to its status as the religion of the majority, while guaranteeing the freedom of all other sects. This agreement acknowledged a critical lesson learned through the blood of the revolution, that the state could not dictate the conscience of its people, yet it must ensure that no single religion held enough power to threaten the republic. The journey from the civil constitution's forced loyalty to the eventual legal pluralism of the Napoleonic era represents a crucial, albeit painful, evolution in French history. It marked the slow death of the church as a political power and the birth of the modern state's role as a guarantor of individual rights, including the right to believe, or not to believe, as one chooses. October 6, 1789, Versailles. For centuries, this palace had been the unchallenged center of an absolute monarchy, where the king's word was law and the divine right of kings dictated the fate of millions. But as the sun set on that fateful day, the echoes of a peasant march reverberating through the grand halls signaled a rupture not just in French history, but in the very fabric of human civilization. The storm that battered the Bastille was merely the opening act. The true legacy of the French Revolution was not the destruction of the old order, but the construction of a new blueprint for the modern world. By the time the smoke of the guillotine cleared and Napoleon Bonaparte seized the reins of power in 1799, the experiment had yielded results that would echo for 200 years. The most tangible gift to the modern world was the codification of law. Through the Napoleonic Code, the chaotic legal patchwork of the ancient regime was replaced by a unified system based on the principles of equality before the law, secularism, and the protection of private property. This legal framework did not remain confined to France. It was exported across Europe through conquest and diplomacy, dismantling feudal privileges in Germany, Italy, and beyond. It taught nations that justice should not be a commodity purchased by the rich, but a right guaranteed to every citizen. Simultaneously, the revolution unleashed a tsunami of political philosophy that swept away the concept of inherited authority. The asterisk Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen asterisk, though born of a specific crisis, became the spiritual ancestor of countless modern constitutions. Its assertion that sovereignty resides in the nation, not in a monarch, gave birth to the concept of nationalism. Suddenly, people began to identify not as subjects of a king, but as citizens of a nation. This shift fueled the rise of liberal democracies and republics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, from the unification of Italy and Germany to the independence movements across the Americas and Africa. The idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed is the bedrock of contemporary democratic governance, a direct inheritance from the National Assembly of 1789. Socially, the revolution shattered the rigid glass ceiling of the ancient regime. The nobility and the clergy were no longer automatically superior by birth. Their status now depended on merit, talent, and contribution. While the path to true equality remained fraught with struggle, the legal dismantling of serfdom and the abolition of feudal dues fundamentally altered the European social contract. It created the possibility of social mobility, establishing the precedent that one's future should be determined by one's own efforts rather than the accident of birth. This meritocratic ideal remains the driving force behind modern educational and professional systems. Furthermore, the revolution redefined the relationship between the state and religion. By separating church and state and enforcing the freedom of conscience, the revolutionaries ended the centuries-old dominance of the Catholic Church over political life. While the process was often violent and inconsistent, the ultimate outcome was a society where religious belief became a personal choice rather than a civic obligation. This separation is a cornerstone of the secular states that dominate the modern political landscape today. Yet, the legacy of 1789 is also a warning. The revolution demonstrated the volatile nature of popular sovereignty and the terrifying potential of unchecked radicalism. The oscillation between the terror and the dictatorship of Napoleon taught subsequent generations that liberty requires vigilance, and that the machinery of democracy must be guarded against the very passions it seeks to liberate. The French Revolution did not merely end an era. It began the long, winding road toward the modern age, leaving behind a world where the rights of the individual are paramount, where the law applies equally to all, and where the voice of the people is the ultimate authority.